Remember back in the early to mid 2010s when Pixar was just starting to become hit or miss, and we were all left to wonder, is this just a dry spell, or is every new release from them going to feel like cutting a wire on a bomb?
It is my professional opinion that now is the time to panic!
But there's one particular film from, I guess you could call it modern Pixar, that in a lot of ways feels like a downgrade from some of their early work, but in other ways is some of the best drama and character writing that they've ever put out. Say hello to Monsters University.
Hello.
This is a movie that you tend to see a lot of positive and negative opinions towards, and honestly, both sides feel really justified, which makes it a fairly interesting film to me. The main thing I want to talk about is the film's characterization, because there's a lot of good and bad to say about them. Luckily, the two main characters, arguably the most important aspects of the film, are handled genuinely great. Say what you want about the idea of making a Monsters, Inc. prequel, but I think the backstory that it gives Mike and Sully genuinely adds a lot to their overall story. It's not what you'd expect, but it also mostly makes sense outside of like one or two minor retcons.
You've been jealous of my good looks since the 4th grade, pal.
Mike is presented with this backstory of wanting to become a scarer, which is an interesting direction considering what we saw from him in the original. Scarers in Monsters, Inc. were idolized by the monster world.
Oh, they're so awesome!
So when you see a character like Mike, who works in the scaring industry but seems to focus more on the behind-the-scenes work while his colleague racks up most of the attention, you might wonder why he's content with that. In Monsters University, we learned that Mike originally wanted desperately to be a scarer, and by extension wanted to prove his worth to a world that didn't seem to pay him any attention.
Out of the way, Wazowski. You don't belong on a scare floor.
In particular, I really like this subtle piece of foreshadowing. We see Mike as a kid on a field trip to Monsters Incorporated, and the class is encouraged to give their best roars.
It's like this. Hey guys, watch this one. Hey, I got a really good.
Mike tries to get everyone's attention, but nobody really notices him, so he just goes for it. Everyone goes silent and turns, and for a second, Mike is proud of himself. Only to then realize they're not looking at him. They're looking at the scarers entering the scare floor, mirroring a similar scene from the first movie. Mike doesn't seem to mind because he's just as starstruck as everyone else. But what he doesn't seem to realize is that being ignored in favor of more naturally gifted scarers is just gonna become a running theme in the years to come. Cut to several years later when Mike has enrolled in Monsters University and is introduced to the other main character and Mike's dynamic with him.
Who can tell me the properties of an effective roar?
The roar's resonance, the duration of the roar, and the...
I heard someone say roar, so I just kind of went for it.
Very impressive.
Here we have the young James P. Sullivan, and with him the kind of social hierarchy that exists in the monster world. Notice how just one admittedly impressive roar was enough to cause the whole class, including the professor, to completely stop listening to Mike, who was giving a clearly well-researched answer in favor of praising a student who disrupted the lesson without even knowing what the question was. And throughout the first act, we see this get reinforced. There's this scene where Mike and Sully are chasing down a pig that Sully stole from a rival university, complete with a couple of reused voice clips from Monsters, Inc. Throughout the chase, Sully doesn't exactly prove very helpful, just running along and not really gaining on the pig. Mike, however, shows that he's a little more clever and strategic. He outmaneuvers the pig in a way Sully doesn't think to, instinctually jumps over a table while Sully just clumsily falls over it, and he very quickly thinks of how to use his environment to capture it.
Got it!
And yet, despite all that, Sully is the one who gets all the credit, to the point where several fraternities start clamoring to get him to join.
Any freshman with the guts to pull off a stunt like that has got future scarer written all over him.
Hey, did you see me ride the pig? That took guts. Slow down, squirt.
It's also throughout these sequences, and the ones following them, that we learn what Sully was like in his younger years. And again, it's not what you'd expect, but it really works. Sully, throughout Monsters, Inc. was a very popular scarer due to how talented he was, on top of just being a really friendly guy. Monsters University, though, has kind of an interesting subversion in that while he has some talent as a scarer and everyone initially loves him for it, he's actually not really that good at it. He ignores his studies, fails anything even slightly more complicated than a basic roar, and on a number of occasions gets outperformed by the one student nobody had faith in.
That is some remarkable improvement, Michael. One frightening face does not a scarer make, Mr. Sullivan.
Also, contrary to what you saw from him in Monsters, Inc., he's actually kind of an arrogant jerk. To varying degrees. Sully's behavior, and also his rivalry with Mike, has a pretty natural evolution throughout the first act. In his initial introduction, it's heavily implied that Sully is just used to the world revolving around him, and as a result, he isn't particularly considerate of other people. And we see a bit of that in his first interaction with Mike, barging into his room by mistake, not apologizing, and then roping Mike into shenanigans he clearly wants no part of.
Okay, I'll lift the bed, you grab the pig. Ready?
What?
1,
No.
2,
No.
3. Don't let go. Careful, he's a biter.
Throughout the interaction, Sully is being rude and thoughtless to Mike, but not really antagonistic. He just kind of assumes that Mike is happy to go along with the stunts he's pulling because that's basically what he's come to expect out of the people he interacts with. Then when Sully gets in with the cool kids, with Mike unsuccessfully trying to do the same, we see that Sully is at least sensitive enough to at least try and let him down gently.
This is a party for scare students.
I am a scare student.
I mean for scare students who actually, have a chance.
He's not very good at it, but he's at least not actively trying to make Mike feel bad. It's only after the people he wants to impress start egging him on that he starts actively dismissing Mike.
My chances are just as good as yours.
You're not even in the same league with me.
That adds a bit of depth to Sully behaving the way he does. In later scenes where we see that Sully isn't actually that good of a scarer, he's clearly nervous that he's going to lose everyone's respect, and so he retaliates by asserting dominance over the more competent student that he sees as a threat.
Unlike you, I had to work hard to get into the scare program.
That's because you don't belong here.
So for the two main characters, it's a pretty solid basis for a conflict and explores these characters we know and love in a new and interesting way. Hey guys, check out my Patreon for access to these exclusives, link in the description below. But then you have to start looking at the rest of the cast, and they all kind of have their pros and cons. To start out with the most prominent, let's take a look at the members of Mike and Sully's fraternity, Uzma Kappa. These guys basically fill the role of the loser group that you see in a lot of college and high school movies like this. The unpopular crowd who eventually turned out to have a lot more going for them than everyone initially thinks. They're decent characters for what it's worth, and they can be pretty funny at times.
I'm gonna need you to take every instinct you have and bury it deep, deep down. Done.
My main issue with Uzma Kappa, though, is that while they're likable enough, they do all feel a little one note. There aren't really any fundamental changes to their personalities from the start of the movie to the end, and they never get much more complex than what you see of them in the first 5 minutes. Most of the other characters are similarly fine, but not really anything special. There's Dean Hardscrabble, who, to her credit, is very intimidating, and Helen Mirren gives this great condescending performance.
Surprise me? I doubt that very much.
But she's also just kind of absent for a lot of the film's runtime and doesn't have much presence in the story outside of a few scenes. Then there's Johnny Worthington, the stereotypical jock bully type. He's okay, but the stereotype part isn't really played as a joke or subverted in any way. It's just kind of who he is and all he is.
Don't take the loss too hard. You never belonged here anyway.
It's a shame because I think there was an interesting direction they could have gone with him. I remember watching Shea Frillis's video ranking every Pixar villain, and he brings up this scene near the climax.
He's an asshole to Mike the whole film, and then he gets defeated at the Scare Games, and he's kind of surprised by this, but then the next scene he's totally fine and saying, "Hey Sully, welcome back to our team," even though his team lost and Sully was on the team that won. Maybe if he was a little more desperate in this scene, and like his mask came off a bit, and we realized he was just a spoiled rich brat or something.
I think that could actually really work. They could portray him as like this dark reflection of Sully. Considering how Sully is mean to Mike to hide his own insecurities, Johnny could serve as a glimpse into what Sully could have turned into. Just a sad, pathetic guy desperately trying to hold on to his social status because it's the closest thing that he has to meaning in his life. As it is though, as Shea Frillis put it, not terrible, but not impressive. Saying that though, I don't get Shafe's argument that Johnny is the main villain as opposed to Hardscrabble.
Because she was kind of just a stern authority figure who changes her mind in the end.
Okay, but she's also deliberately vindictive and petty towards Sully, and especially Mike. She publicly talks down to them multiple times and literally imposes a rule that if Mike doesn't win a contest, she'll expel him, basically just because she doesn't like him.
If you lose, you will leave Monsters University.
There's one minor character named Claire Wheeler who's played by Aubrey Plaza.
We have a special guest, the founder of the games, Dean Hardscrabble.
I don't have much to say about Claire, and let's be honest, you don't either. I just think it's weird that there's barely any jokes involving her, and it's a waste of such a funny actress.
April, you finalized the rental, right?
Shut up, Anne. I told you never to talk to me.
That was Champion. Oh my god, I'm sorry. Bad dog.
Randall makes an appearance, and he's good for a laugh, but somewhat underutilized. It is funny just how different and friendly he is compared to how vicious he is in Monsters, Inc. And the reveal that the reason he makes that sinister looking squint all the time is actually just because he has poor eyesight. That's pretty good. But his turn to the dark side is completely off screen and is completely irrelevant to the rest of the movie. I mean, yeah, he competes against Uzma Kappa in the Scare Games, but you could give that role to just about anyone for how little development he gets. Again, he works for what he is, but they could have better explored him and Mike going from friends to enemies and his rivalry with Sully. It's just a shame that Pixar couldn't do more with the return of one of their best villains. I also can't help but feel like the movie doesn't do as much with its premise as it really could have. Like, it's a school for monsters. There's a lot you can do with that, and the movie seems to think it's doing a lot with it. Throughout the movie, they keep talking about all these different supposed scaring techniques and strategies and hazards.
Zombie snarl, angry poodle, jazz clown, my Aunt Phyllis, in the morning. That's what I'm talking about.
But whenever we actually see scares being performed, it's rare to see it go any deeper than some tiptoeing and a generic roar. Like, just as an example, there's a scene where a student is given a very specific scenario for a scaring test, and he suggests what seems like it would be a unique scare.
I'm a 5-year-old girl afraid of spiders and Santa Claus. Which scare do you use?
That's a seasonal creep and crawl?
Demonstrate.
But then we actually see the scare, and it looks like this. Why is that the seasonal creep and crawl? What does it have to do with spiders? What the hell does it have to do with Santa Claus? Aside from that, we get some hints of them learning other things like blending into their environment and not touching supposedly toxic human belongings, but it's not something that's explored in very much detail and is usually just restricted to a few clips. And that's kind of a big problem because learning to be a scarer is, you know, the basis for the entire plot. Like, Mike and Sully are really entertaining and they carry the movie pretty well, but two good characters can only carry an underdeveloped story so far. Also, I have to ask, the Scare Games are like an official school-sanctioned event, right? Like, it's not just an informal thing organized exclusively by the students. My point is, if the university is involved in this, couldn't they get a better venue than the fucking sewers?
Of all the sewers on campus, this one has always been my favorite.
Art, you've been here before.
But, okay, I've brought up a lot of okayness throughout this video, so let's bring the focus back to Mike and Sully for the climax. Throughout the movie, Mike has been fighting against the belief that he's not scary. He's heard it from the other students, the dean, even the person he's grown to trust.
You just wanted to help yourself.
Well, what was I supposed to do? Let the whole team fail because you don't have it?
And in a moment where Mike feels more alone than he's ever felt, he makes an unauthorized trip into the human world to prove once and for all that he is scary. And then he isn't.
You look funny.
Sully goes in to save him, and the two talk about how neither of them feel like they're qualified to be scarers. Mike talks about how even though he tried his best, it still wasn't enough. And Sully talks about how even though he has abilities as a scarer, he doesn't know how to channel them into being actually good at it.
I thought if I wanted it enough, I could show everybody that Mike Wazowski is something special.
I act scary, Mike. But most of the time, I'm terrified.
Also, take note of where they're having this conversation. They're in the human world, cut off from any help that they could possibly get, with human law enforcement actively investigating the area. This is one of the most dangerous situations they could be in, but in this moment, they're so fundamentally unhappy with their lives that they're not immediately concerned about saving themselves. But after they've allowed themselves to be emotionally vulnerable with each other, this is how the conversation ends.
How come you never told me that before?
We weren't friends before.
And with that, they finally find some comfort. The world at large may not think highly of them, but they matter to each other. And this leads to a phenomenal climactic moment where they use their now fully formed friendship to save themselves and finally realize the potential they've been searching for. They go back to the door they entered the human world through only to find that it's been deactivated, stranding them there. With no other option, Mike and Sully can only escape through the most ambitious scare they've ever done. They have to use all of Mike's scaring techniques and all of Sully's talent to scare a room of fully grown adults to such an extent that they can power the door from the other world, something that we've never seen done before. It's a brilliant scene with escalating tension and gloomy atmosphere straight out of a horror movie, followed by a scare that generates so much scream energy it overflows a whole room of screen canisters and an explosive power surge in the door. It's a great combination of how Mike and Sully's abilities complete each other and an amazing end to their character arcs. Monsters University, in my opinion, is pretty good. I can understand not liking it. Your enjoyment of it will most likely be based on how well Mike and Sully can carry the story. Did a follow-up to Monsters, Inc. need to exist? Probably not, and you can find no shortage of reviews saying as much. But with all due respect to people who make this argument, what does that actually mean? I mean, outside of stories that end on a cliffhanger, very few sequels simply must exist. The first Toy Story ended on a happy note. It didn't necessarily need sequels, and yet Toy Story 2 and 3 are some of the best sequels ever made. Now, obviously if a movie ends on a definitively conclusive note, then sure, a sequel probably shouldn't be made. Hell, as good as Toy Story 4 was, it's basically the textbook example of that.
I thought those movies were done, dog. They made 3 movies. They did make 3 movies. This is number 4.
But with Monsters, Inc., I mean, narratively, there's no reason they couldn't make a prequel, and they've got a decent story for it. Why not make it? Although, if you're gonna make a Monsters, Inc. movie explicitly about learning how scaring works, could you maybe just include, like, one line explaining why monsters think that kids are toxic? Ever since I was a kid, it's bothered me that the original movie has, like, no explanation for this. But, fine. I guess I'll just take the good story with lovable characters and a profound message about ambition versus reality. I guess. Special shout out to my Patreon supporters Heather Reed and Zelda. Thank you so much for the support.